So a very long time ago, because I'm a lot older than I appear. There's laughter happening over here. Anyway, a long time ago, every summer, I would spend a week or more, sometimes 2 or 3 weeks, as a church camp counselor or camp director. And I did everything from camps for little bitty kids all the way up for camps for teenagers. Church camp can be a transformative experience for kids as well as the adults who are there. For a lot of people, church camp is where they very first feel a close connection with God, and it can be the first time they have any kind of deep thoughts about their place in the world. It's a truly religious experience, and the campground itself can take on the sense of being holy ground. And I learned that early on at church camp. Traditions matter. For the kids who come back year after year, they love singing certain songs. And the day when the camp director always got dunked into the lake, everyone cheered, there's a day for that. And when the boys serenaded the girls at night and vice versa, all very biblical, of course. But maybe the most important church camp tradition of all was the closing circle. The closing circle took place on the very last night of camp. It was where everyone, maybe 100 people, held hands or linked arms, and people sang moving songs and talked about their experiences that week. It was the culmination of everything, and it could be very emotional. A lot of the kids had grown really close that week, and they'd spent that week bonding in significant ways, and they knew they might not see each other again until the next summer, unless they were graduating from high school. And after that, who knew when they would ever see each other again? Well, one year at high school, at a high school camp I was directing, we decided to hold the closing circle in a different spot at the campground than where we had held it before. We moved it for very practical reasons, because the old location was this grassy area down by the lake, and there were swarms of mosquitoes down there, and the adults at least complained bitterly about the prospect of having their blood sucked dry for an hour. Weaklings. Anyway, so this time we moved the closing circle to a large paved patio farther away from the water, and it all went great. The songs, the remembrances, and the emotionally charged, heartfelt farewells. And best of all, a lot fewer mosquitoes. Now, some years after I moved on from doing church camps, I was pushing a shopping cart through a grocery store when I heard my name being called. It was a young man in his late 20s who had attended that high school church camp I had directed. It was great to see him, and he caught me up on what he was doing with his life, and we both couldn't believe how fast time flies. So it was that kind of conversation. But then he said, I really hated that we held the closing circle at camp my senior year up on that patio. I said, why? He said, because it was a tradition for the closing circle to be down by the lake. When we did it up at the patio, it just wasn't the same. It was a different feeling. I said, oh, well, I didn't realize the location was such a big deal. We just moved it because of mosquitoes. And he said, but the mosquitoes were part of the tradition too. He was serious, which made no sense to me, but it made sense to him because the location for that ceremony was an emotional thing. He'd been looking forward to it all week long. He had visualized it. It linked him to all of his past experiences of being there, and I had gone and ruined his tradition. I didn't have the heart to tell him that the location for the closing circle had actually changed a lot over the years, but that wouldn't have mattered. What mattered to him was the tradition that he knew and loved. Humans are nostalgic creatures. We treasure the ways of doing things that mean a lot to us emotionally. I know families where every Thanksgiving, people continue to sit around the table in the exact same seat year after year after year. Once I served a church where on every Christmas Eve, the service ended with a woman singing a solo of "O Holy Night" from the back of the church. The same woman had been singing that song for over 60 years, believe it or not, year in and year out, ever since she was in her 20s. Now, even though her voice wasn't quite as strong as it used to be, and she struggled a bit to reach that big high note at the very end of that song, to suggest that maybe someone else could sing "O Holy Night" on Christmas Eve, That would have gotten you kicked out of that church in a hurry. It was a tradition. It's always a tricky proposition to mess with tradition, especially when it comes to religion. Now, the Bible doesn't give us any clear instructions about where a church camp closing circle must be held or who should sing O Holy Night on Christmas Eve. But the truth is, the Bible really has very little to say about any of our traditions because people created those traditions much, much later. And what it does say about traditions, at least what Jesus had to say about them, would get him kicked out of most churches in a hurry. We don't often think about Jesus like that, but he was constantly breaking with tradition. And it did not win him any fans among those who were deeply emotionally invested in traditions and who found their way of identity in them. What they didn't understand was that Jesus, he wasn't against traditions in themselves. He just knew that a lot of traditions were counterproductive. They formed a barrier to everyday people. There were plenty of folks back then who otherwise would have liked to enrich their spiritual lives and grow in their understanding of God's love and serve others, but they were prevented from doing that because of all the traditions that mattered to the people who went to church all the time that the average person just could not relate to. For example, one tradition had to do with washing your hands before you ate. Now, this wasn't normal hand washing to clean the dirt from your hands, but a special ritual that church elders had developed over time. It was highly stylized and involved saying just the right words as you did it. That tradition mattered to the very religious people, and it was a showy kind of thing that you did in front of other approving church people. Oh, yes, they did it just right. But it was very time-consuming, and it wasn't relevant to the average person on the street. It's not as if they didn't already wash their hands before eating. Of course they did. They just found it ridiculous to be required to wash in a special way and to speak this long litany while their food was getting cold. The point, after all, is to eat. And Jesus knew that you could do that and give God thanks for the food without enduring some elaborate ritual full of a bunch of religious mumbo jumbo that no one else really cared about. So Jesus said so. He pointed out that traditions, if they ever get in the way of the basics, can do more harm than good. They're more about preserving the form of things rather than focusing on what really matters. For instance, who really cares who sits where at Thanksgiving as long as everyone has a place at the table? And the form of things in a religious setting, saying just the right words that only insiders know, standing up and sitting down at just the right moments, following just the right order of worship, and playing just the right type of music. If we ever hear ourselves say we're doing any of those kinds of things out of tradition, we need to take a hard look at them and ask the very same question Jesus did. Is this more about preserving something that makes us feel good because we have always done it this way? Is the tradition an essential part of our identity? Then should it be? Now, there may be nothing at all wrong with tradition, but we do need to ask this: are any of our traditions getting in the way of everyday people being able to enrich their spiritual lives and grow and their understanding of God's love? In any religious tradition, it's important to know where things came from and why. Traditions don't just fall out of the sky. Salem is part of the United Church of Christ, so we're actually a collection of 4 distinct religious groups in America that eventually merged into 2 groups and finally into one group way back in the late 1950s. But long before that was a massive event in world history called the Protestant Reformation. You may have heard of it. It began in Europe in the 1500s when some influential priests and their politically powerful friends split with the Roman Catholic Church, or it was the only church at that time. Now, why did they break off? There were a lot of reasons, but a major part of it was that the traditions of the Catholic Church, the Reformers believed, were out of touch with everyday people. The Reformers, Martin Luther, for instance, in Germany, and Thomas Cranmer in England, they wanted people to be able to read the Bible in their own native language. They thought that everyone ought to be able to read it on their own rather than have to rely on a priest telling them what it said, because the priest was reading it from Latin. So they had it translated from Latin into German in Germany and into English in England. The leaders of the Reformation used the same reasoning Jesus did. Tradition was getting in the way of letting regular folks get to know God in their own way. Now, I'm not going to bore you with a long history lesson, but what happened next is kind of interesting. It didn't take long for the new Protestant churches to develop their own correct words to say in a worship service, their own special traditions that they believed were the best way of doing things. And they often disagreed with each other about that, so a whole lot of splinter groups developed. Just picture a very big, fast-growing tree with new branches popping out all the time. Because once you start a reformation, it's really hard to put that genie back into the bottle. And sure enough, each new branch believed that their way of doing things was the best and most pleasing to God. And very importantly, it was the most likely way of being the church that everyday people could relate to. Each kind of church began with the idea of tossing out the tradition it once belonged to. So what do? They made up whole new traditions to distinguish themselves from their old heretic cousins down the street. It's kind of crazy, but that's exactly what happened. And that's why we have Episcopalians, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, Reformed churches, independent churches, and on and on and on and on. Now, that's a huge oversimplification of church history. But you might think that after time, people would realize that by imposing specific traditions in their branch of the big Christian tree, they weren't necessarily making it any easier for everyday people to enrich their spiritual lives and to grow in their understanding of God's love and how to serve others. But we shouldn't be too hard on the good folks who came before us. They were genuinely good, faithful people doing their very best. And they were only humans, so that means they naturally created traditions. It's just that so many of the traditions they developed became, over time, objects of worship in themselves, saying just the right words in just the right sequence and playing just the right music. It was a lot like holding the closing circle down by the lake, or having the same person sing "O Holy Night" year after year. You just don't mess with those things. They didn't worry about proper hand washing like the religious folks did back in the time of Jesus, but what they didn't always realize was the principle Jesus pointed out still matters, and that is, don't let your tradition get in anybody's way. Don't let it get in the way of the person who's never been to church before and who wouldn't have a clue about what to expect or what they should do if they even dared to attend in the first place. About a third of the population now fits that description, by the way. They have absolutely no religious background, or they haven't been to church since they were a little kid. And don't let it get in the way of someone who's given up on organized religion because their impression of church people is that they're old-fashioned Bible-thumping hypocrites who exclude and demonize gay people. About a quarter of the population believes that about the church to one degree or another. They're not just unaffiliated, these people. They're actually not exactly big fans of any church. So we need to always ask ourselves, are any of our traditions standing in the way of those folks, those everyday people who are so many of our neighbors and family members and friends and coworkers? Is anything we're doing getting in the way of anyone finding spiritual nurture and a connection to beloved community and an avenue for serving others? You know, when I had that conversation with a young man in the grocery store who'd been to church camp, I asked him if he still went to the same church he had way back then. He sheepishly said that no, he'd stopped going a long time ago. He didn't go to any church anymore. And I said, well, look, dude, I'm not the church police, but I'd really like to know why. He said he was busy with his job and his family, but then he paused and said, you know, mostly I just don't get much out of it anymore. All those old traditions and things, I just can't relate to them. And then he said, but if church was more like church camp, I would go. I reminded him that even church camp had traditions, and he was the one who didn't like it when we changed where the closing circle had been located. But I asked what it was about church camp that really mattered to him and made it worth going. And he said this: I felt connected. It felt real. And like I got to know who God is and who I am through my friends. And that might have been the very best description I've ever heard of why anyone no longer goes to church, but also why they would go to church if it was more like church camp. I think back on that conversation frequently. Traditions matter to all of us, and we naturally can't help ourselves from creating them. It's just what we do. But we also can't let them get in the way of what really matters. Being connected to others, finding community, serving others, and discovering who God is and who we are through our friends. That, my friends, is a tradition worth keeping.